Welcome to a tutorial video on Twine 2.3. In this video I'm going to talk about variables in Harlowe 3. In programming terminology, a variable can be thought of as a bucket. That is, we put values into them and we see what's inside the bucket. In Harlowe, there are two types of variables: story variables and temporary variables. Story variables start with a $sign. As story variables, they last as long as the story itself does. If the story is closed, the story is not running, and the story variables now don't exist. Story variables in Harlowe, like in other programming environments, follow a standard convention. They can contain letters and numbers. They cannot contain spaces. Temporary variables are different from story variables in two key ways. They last as long as the current passage does, and they start with the underscore. Once created, story variables survive as long as the story does, and we see here the value is 10. Temporary variables, on the other hand, only last as long as the passage in which they were created. We now see an error. This temporary variable doesn't exist anymore. Let's go look at the code. Moving over here to the second passage, story variables, we see the text I read. We also see the use right here of a macro. This is the set macro. This allows us to create or change the value of different variables. In this case, if the variable does not already exist, it will be created in its value set. Right here we see example variable. Notice it contains letters and no spaces. It is a story variable because it starts with the $sign, and we're setting example variable to the value 10. We can then immediately use that right here in this line. The value is 10. And if we jump immediately to that, we see the value is 10. And you see down here it tells us that we're looking at this. In the debug view, example variable is the number 10. Close this. Moving over to temporary variables, we see the same thing again. In this case, however, we're using the underscore because this is a temporary variable and not a story variable. We see here the underscore and then a different name, second example variable, again setting it to 10. And if we run this using debug, we see in this passage is the number 10. So we can see in both cases, story variables starting with a $sign and temporary variables starting with the underscore are ways to use values in different ways. I mentioned the metaphor of buckets because we're putting values into these, and then we're seeing what's inside that bucket right after that. Those are the lines, the value is whatever. In the two cases of story and temporary, we're immediately checking to see what's inside that bucket again. As a final review, let's look at this last passage. That's where we had the error. If we immediately jump down here, we see this error again. And this is a reminder that temporary variables only exist within the passage in which they created. So you may ask yourself, why use temporary variables at all? Well, because they can be very useful for making calculations. Say you want to save different parts of different steps, or you want to quickly compute some statistics for your player. Well, you could do that using temporary variables, store different values of different steps, add them together, and then save them if you want to in a story variable that will be maintained across the story. Thanks for watching.